What's up guys, Squid Dude here, and today I have a short little video going over twisting wire, and not just twisting wire, but the different things you can do with twisted wire to make different variations to use in some of your advanced builds. This is going to be the first video of my Back to Basics series. I still am going to have plenty of advanced build tutorial videos and tips and tricks, but I also wanted to make some shorter videos that kind of go over these basics. When I first started building around 3 years ago, all there was basic stuff out there in terms of YouTube videos and the knowledge that was out there. So I spent quite a few months learning the basics and just doing basic things, and through that process I learned a lot about the materials that I was using, how the wire would behave and in different configurations, and it's what really gave me a great foundation to go ahead and explore other ideas I had, and that eventually I ended up coming up with some solid concepts that are replicated daily now. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Alright, so when it comes to twisting wire, there's not much to it, but there's a couple things you consider. You can always twist 2 pieces, 3, 4, 5 pieces of wire together. Some people I've seen, they'll take 40 pieces of 40 gauge and lightly twist them together and use that as the core of a frame multi-core fused Clapton for some of those more advanced builds. But in this tutorial, I'm just going to be taking 3 pieces of 28 gauge and we're going to be twisting them together, and I'm going to try to twist them as tightly as possible. So the first step would be to just get the amount of pieces that you're going to twist and get roughly equal lengths, and then we'll go from there. Alright, so I have my 3 pieces of 28 gauge. I am using Kanthal A1, I forgot to mention that. But the next step, what we need to do is to go ahead and straighten the wire. Now, I know in previous videos I've shown different ways of straightening wire. Of course, you can just pull it off of the spool and give it a tug, and you can also put it in your drill and twist it up. All of these methods work, but in the sake of trying to make a twisted wire, an old man I used to know, he swore up and down he used to be a jewelry maker, and in jewelry what they would do when they would twist wire together is they would twist the individual pieces of wire in a drill but in one direction, and then when they went to twist all of them together, that they would twist all of them together in the opposite direction. And the idea, I guess, is that this allows the wire or the metal to stretch more, giving you a tighter twist. Now, if this is true or not, I have no idea, but ever since meeting this old man, I've just always done it that way. So let's go ahead and straighten these up. So when you're straightening your wire, you want to take a couple things into consideration. The smaller the wire you're using, the smaller the diameter is, the more you straighten it, you actually could potentially break the wire because it's so thin and it'll become brittle. So when you go to straighten wire like this, you don't really need to lay into it too long. You just a couple seconds and it'll be straight and you'll be good to go. So now I'll go ahead and I'll just cut the ends off where the one ends were in the chuck. They might be a little bent, and also on the other end that I was holding with a pair of pliers, just so that they're all nice and straight and they lay up against each other nice and smooth. So what I like to do prior to twisting these all together is I will take however many wires, in this case 3, and I'll butt them up at the end, and the end that is going to go into the chuck of the drill, I'll actually start to hand twist them together. And what this does is, by twisting them all together, the chuck is cylindrical, so when it goes to clamp down on this, it will have more of even pressure distributed across all 3 pieces of the wire, as opposed to if you were just take it like this and stick it into the drill, there's a really good possibility that not only will it not be centered in the drill, but one of the pieces will be looser than the other. So the way I actually like to go ahead and tighten the ends is with 2 sets of pliers. I'll clamp down on one end, and I also use this same technique if I were to do a braid and I was prepping wire to braid. So I'll clamp down on this end, and then I'll start to hand twist it. Let me get it better. And then I'll finish twisting with the pliers, which I can get a much tighter twist with the pliers. Then once I have a nice solid twist there, I'll cut any excess off, and now I have a nice mounting point for the wire and the drill. The most critical part of this whole thing is to get all your wire as centered as possible, and to get each piece of the wire to be locked down on with the same amount of pressure. So once you get them in the chuck, go ahead and pull on them pretty nicely to make sure nothing's moving. And then at this point, we're about ready to start twisting them together. So I got my wire nice and secure and mounted into the drill. So the next step is obviously to twist this all together. So keep in mind, I twisted each one of these pieces of wire individually counterclockwise. So with all of them together, I will be twisting them clockwise. So the trick with this is, once you have it secure, you're going to want to run your fingers down the length of the wires, and I generally try to keep them parallel, but what you're trying to do, and you want to do this very firmly, is you want to create an equal amount of tension on the wire that your hand passes through. So what I'll do is I'll do this towards the end to where I still have a good grip on it, and then I'll go ahead and take my pliers and clamp down on the portion that I've already tightened with my fingers. Once I get a good connection there, I'll actually bend the leads over to ensure that I have a good hold on them. And if you look, when I'm pulling on this pliers, all 3 pieces of wire have an equal amount of tension in them. This is incredibly important, because if you go to twist up grouping of wire, and one piece of wire, I'll let some slack off, but one piece of wire is loose, what will happen is when that twist starts to form, where that excess slack forms in the twist is where you'll have an imperfection in the twist. So in terms of speed, everyone does this differently. I've heard different things, but for me, what works is I like to start at a slow speed initially. I will slowly spin this until the twist forms along the full length of the wire. Once the twist has formed along the full length of the wire and I see that there are no imperfections, that's when you can really lay into the drill and speed this process up. So we'll go ahead and slowly twist this together. Also keep in mind, you want to keep a lot of pressure pulling against the wire, but as this twists, the wire is compressing. So even though you're pulling on it, you still want to allow the wire to naturally retract. So once again, that's a feeling, and this might take a couple tries for you, but once you get it down, it becomes second nature. Okay, so at this point I have a nice even twist along the full length of wire. This can be really taxing on your hand, so at this point I'm going to go ahead and speed up the rotation of the drill and get it even tighter. I'm going to go ahead and stop for a moment and let go of these pliers here. And one thing you'll notice, if you're pulling way too hard on those pliers in the drill, you will snap the wire before it is even fully twisted. But it has a really nice tight twist here. I'm just going to trim off the end here so I can get a better grip with my pliers and proceed to twist it a little bit more. And this is kind of a give and take. You'll want to twist it a little bit and see, you know, how close your twist is, and kind of really hone it into what you're looking for. So we'll just do a little bit more here. All right, so I think I have it twisted just enough. One thing, if you do get all your wire mounted in there nice and centered, and while you're twisting this and it's getting tighter and tighter, if you notice that the wire starts to wobble on you and it's no longer rotating smoothly, then that's a good sign that you're about to over twist it, and you could be left with not a straight piece of twisted wire. So I think where we're at is pretty good, and yeah, we've just twisted 3 pieces of 28 gauge together. So we just finished making this perfectly twisted triple 28 gauge Canthal A1 piece of wire, and at this point you could go ahead and coil this up and start vaping on it. But I'm also wanting to show you guys how to do a helix and exactly what a helix is. And so a helix capitalizes off of the geometry of what a twisted wire makes. So when you twist multiple pieces of wire together, you get little grooves of where those different pieces of wire are meeting. And so the idea behind the helix is you take a smaller wire and you feed it inside of that groove. Now, if you use a pretty small wire, in this case I'm going to be using 36 gauge for the helix wire. The 36 gauge is so small, it's pretty negligible in terms of resistance and heating the element. But what it does add is it adds more surface area and more density to the overall wire, which is going to give you a little bit better warmth. It's going to give you more flavor, of course, and it also looks beautiful. And there's all kinds of things you can fit multiple different pieces of wire in the same groove. But so since we took 3 pieces of 28 gauge, we actually have 3 separate grooves. So we're going to actually have to do this process 3 different times. And a lot of people helix different ways, but the way in which I helix is I like to work off of the spool. So I went ahead and took my 36 gauge and I cut 3 pieces of wire, roughly about 3 times the length of the twisted wire that I had made. 3 times the length is more than enough. I'm not very frugal when it comes to wire. You could get away with, you know, twice the length, but what I find with the extra length, I'm able to hold on to it, and the way in which I hold the 36 gauge in my hand as it feeds to the twisted core, that extra length allows me to get a better grip, and you'll see that in the close-up. So the first step, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and take our first piece of 36 gauge, and what I like to do is to just go ahead and start manually twisting in this piece as tight as I can, just a couple times. That way the piece of 36 gauge is already in a groove prior to mounting it into the drill. So now that I have it mounted into the drill, like I said, since this piece of 36 gauge is roughly 3 feet long, you want to make sure whatever work surface you're working on is free of debris or other stuff. That way the 36 gauge, if it's moving along, it doesn't snag anything and potentially kink on you while you're feeding this in there. So the way that I like to do this, the Helix portion, is much like how I like to hold thinner wire when I do a Clapton. And so the end goal is to have your 36 gauge coming out in between your index finger and your thumb as close to the core as possible, and then allowing your index finger to add support to the unsupported portion of the core wire. But what I do that's a little bit different is I'll actually take the wire and loop it and pinch it in between my pinky finger and my ring finger down below. And what this allows me to do is I can hold tension on the wire from my pinky to my finger easier than if I were to just hold this piece of 36 gauge by itself with my 2 fingers up against the core. This just allows me to keep a nice, even, consistent amount of pressure on there, because there's nothing worse than a loose Helix. Even if you get it in the grooves but it's pretty loose, it's not gonna stay there, and then when you go to coil it up, the part that you did Helix, those pieces of wire will kind of splay out away from the core. So this is just a little trick that I do in order to get a tighter Helix. And since it's following a groove, once you find that sweet spot, you should be able to just keep going. So there's a couple things I forgot to mention when you're feeding the Helix wire to that core. Because those grooves are angled, the Helix wire that you're feeding to the core, you have to feed it at an angle, and finding that just that perfect angle to where it's falling into place, that might take a little bit of time. Usually I always mess up a little bit towards the chuck of the drill. And the speed at which you move also, you know, the faster you spin the drill, the faster your hand has to move down there. So really it's a matter of syncing up the angle at which you're feeding it, the speed at which you're rotating the drill, and the speed at which you're moving your hand down along the wire. So if you mess up, you can simply, you know, reverse the drill. Make sure you always have pressure on that Helix wire, and that's pretty much all there is to it. So like I said, since we did 3 pieces of 26 gauge or 28 gauge and we have 3 different grooves, we'll go ahead and do this 2 more times. So up to this point, we've taken 3 pieces of 28 gauge Kanthal and twisted those all together, and then we helixed them 3 times with 36 gauge nichrome. And at this point, you could go ahead, coil it up and vape it, but I want to show you another twisting technique that is known as spiral wire, or the spiral technique. This was first created by Twisted Messes quite a few years ago, and the idea behind it is you take a pair of toothless pliers, and while the wire is mounted in the drill and spinning, you gently run the pliers down the length of the wire, each time adding a little bit more pressure. And what you're doing is you're taking microns and you're slowly polishing the outside surface of the wire of your twisted core. And so what this does, other than just smooth out the outside surface of the wire, is if you were to take a piece of wire like this, a piece of twisted wire that wasn't spiraled, and you stick it underwater, that water is just going to pass right through it. While a piece of spiral wire, when it has water running over it, the water is actually going to collect and bead off of the wire. So in theory, that helps improve with wicking, much like how you do a mirror finish to the outside surface of a coil. So this process is pretty simple. It helps to have a little lubricant. I always use juice because it's always laying around, but you can use vegetable oil and so forth. But we'll go ahead and make a couple passes. I also forgot to mention, prior to doing this, you want to make sure that the wire in its full length is nice and smooth and there's no kinks. I went ahead and cut the ends off again from the previous work that I've done up to this point. You want to make sure you get it nice and centered in the drill. Less is more when it comes to the juice or lubricating it. So I just drop a little bit on there, run it down the length of the wire. And for the first couple passes, like I mentioned, you'll want to be super light with it and just gentle with how much pressure you're clamping down with the pliers. And what you'll notice is after you start doing a couple passes, you know, you can do as many passes as you want. However, there's only so much material to take off. But you'll notice when you're moving down the wire, there will be parts that feel smoother and parts that feel rougher. And in those areas that feel a little rougher, that's where I'll try to add a little bit more pressure to try to get a more uniform shaving of the wire across the full length. So we'll go ahead, do this a couple more times and finish it up. So that should be plenty good enough. What you'll notice is after you do this a few times, you're gonna get some black residue on your hand. What that is, that's actually fine metal particles that are coming off of the wire. So now I'm gonna go clean this up. We'll get a couple close-up shots so you can see what this process ends up looking like and what the finish on it is. And yeah, that's basically, these are the techniques that you can use for your most basic coils all the way up to implementing them in more advanced builds. But twisting is a very powerful tool, and hopefully a couple of these methods, maybe you already knew how to do them, maybe you learned something new, but I'll keep some of the more basic concepts flowing. Also in this day and age with so many great builders out there, a lot of new builders coming up, they skip this whole part of building, and they really don't know the foundation and kind of how it evolved. But I will be covering a lot of more basic stuff, but I enjoy building even if it is basic. So hopefully this was helpful. We'll catch you next time.